A major update regarding the two-tier sentencing guidelines, and the BBC, in my view, has got it wrong. Now, I mean this with the greatest respect, but this is really important. So we're talking about the sentencing guidelines that would have come into effect today that would have, in my view, created a two-tier justice system. Now, as I explained in previous videos, I understand why the Sentencing Council was looking at producing these guidelines and implementing these guidelines, but again, I just think that it creates the wrong impression. It creates the wrong sense of two-tier in the justice system that the general public will not appreciate. But as I said, the BBC, in my respectful view, has got its reporting wrong on this, at least in some sense. So if you like the brutal honesty with which I bring to this channel, the accurate news on what's really going on, please do subscribe. About half of you don't. That hurts my feelings. I wish you would do that because I spend a lot of time doing these videos. So let's have a look and let's see why I think it's wrong, in my opinion, obviously. The BBC reports, sentencing guidelines ditched after two-tier row. Now, you've probably heard this reported elsewhere, that the Sentencing Council has given in and they've just abandoned their new sentencing guidelines under pressure from the government. In fact, the BBC uses as much wording here. The next bit down here says, new rules on sentencing criminals from ethnic minorities have been abandoned following a weeks-long standoff between senior judges and the government. The senior judges, by the way, because many of the members of the Sentencing Council are very senior members of the judiciary. But again, the point here is the BBC reports it as they've abandoned the guidelines, which is not really true, and I'll explain why. Now, the official update from the Sentencing Council is thus. They say the Sentencing Council remains of the view that its guideline imposing community and custodial sentences, as drafted, is necessary and appropriate. Because, as I've mentioned in previous videos, they want to address the disparity in sentencing among communities. Therefore, following a meeting between the Lord Chancellor and the Chairman of the Sentencing Council yesterday, at that meeting, the Lord Chancellor indicated her intention to introduce legislation, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, imminently, that would have the effect of rendering that section on cohorts in this guideline unlawful. The Lord Chancellor also shared details of the draft legislation as it's likely to be introduced. Again, more about that in a minute. Chairman of the Sentencing Council indicated that the Council would not introduce a guideline where there's a draft bill due for imminent introduction that would make it unlawful. On that basis, the Council, an independent statutory body, has chosen to delay the in-force date of the guideline pending such legislation taking effect. So, if that legislation does not take effect, because remember, it's a bill, it has to go through law in the normal way, has to be introduced into Parliament, it has to be debated by the House of Commons, then it has to move to the Lords, etc., etc. It can be fast-tracked, which Keir Starmer's indicated, more about that in a minute. But without that, it's not law. And without it being law, it's not been abandoned and it's not been ditched, as the BBC reported, with great respect. That's just plain wrong. It hasn't been ditched at all. It's been delayed pending this legislation. Maybe the BBC will update their headlines. Maybe they won't. Maybe they will if they see my video. But they've said here that it's been ditched and they've abandoned it following this week's long standoff. It says the new rules, which would be binding on judges, which is not necessarily true. Whilst courts must follow these sentencing guidelines across England and Wales when taking a consistent approach to sentencing, they don't have to follow them if it is contrary to the interests of justice to do so, which arguably this might be. If they had two offenders, let's say in the same case even, and one was from an ethnic minority group and the other was not, and the other one was white British, then the judge then might be looking at those sentencing guidelines to say, well, we have to treat these two individuals very slightly differently. And that would be, in my view, that would be contrary to the interests of justice because it would be unfair. And that's where the two-tier bit comes from. And as I said in previous videos, judges are sensible and they are going to look at each case on its own merits, on its own facts, consider the guidelines, etc. So over to the law and let's see what's actually happening. So this was published today following the statement from Keir Starmer on Monday, yesterday, and their meeting yesterday morning. This says the government is introducing legislation to block new sentencing guidelines. It says, Lord Chancellor will today introduce legislation to stop guidelines coming into effect that single out different treatment of ethnic minority offenders on sentencing. Parliament will debate the legislation and it will become law as quickly as possible. New sentencing guidelines would mean that different treatment for different races and religions will be blocked under new legislation set to be introduced today. And so, as I said, this has to go through the process and become law before it's binding, and it is subject to that the Sentencing Council has delayed the onset of these new guidelines. So, not ditched. So, there is a chance that this legislation falls. I doubt it, but there is a chance that this fails. But it's more than likely to go through, it's more than likely to work, and therefore the guidelines are more than likely not to come into force. But it's not quite as straightforward as that. The government will work with Parliament to fast-track the legislation, clarify the guidance relating to sentencing reports, should not single out specific cohorts for different treatment when it comes to ordering pre-sentence reports, which help judges make decisions on sentencing. This follows formal objections by Lord Chancellor, etc., etc. Shabana Mahmood said, these guidelines create a justice system where the outcomes could be influenced by race, culture and religion. The differential treatment is unacceptable. Equality before the law is the backbone of public confidence in our justice system. I will change the law to ensure fairness for all in our courts, and I'm grateful to the Sentencing Council for delaying the implementation while Parliament considers this bill. And it's called the Sentencing Guidelines Pre-Sentence Reports Bill, to be introduced tomorrow. And the government will seek royal assent as quickly as possible. So I fully understand the logic behind the Sentencing Council looking at this to address the disparity, but at the same time, I have huge question marks as to why this wasn't flagged up earlier, because in their defence, no one flagged this up before. This has got to this point where it's actually coming in, and no one has yet raised it as an issue until now that it's coming into force, and it's just like anything else that unless it affects you and you don't pay attention to it, you don't really make any noise about it and you don't complain about it. Only then it affects you and then you realise how bad it is and then we make noise about it. So I'm not criticising anybody here, but that's just a fact. That's the way these things work. And then because it's in the public eye, obviously people complain about it, and then it's caused this big debate, and now it's taking law, literally law, to make this change. But again, it's really quite drastic that it takes law to force the Sentencing Council to not abandon but put on hold until this becomes law. I would really have thought that this is a public justice system. It has to have the trust and the integrity of the general public to work properly and to be respected properly, quite frankly. And so for one, I am pleased that they have taken this stance to delay it, because it would be a little bit odd to introduce guidelines that, as they say, is now pending law that would block it. But many still ask the question, why not just cancel it? Because that would be easier, that would be quicker, that would be what most people want. And again, I can understand the logic with addressing the disparity, but this is not what the general public will see as a fair justice system when it directly addresses different cohorts from different cultural minorities and backgrounds differently. So there it is. It's been delayed, not abandoned. So just to clarify what the headlines are reporting here. But as always, let me know what you think in the comment section below. Please do subscribe to the channel for accurate updates. And I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.